On Friday, the Supreme Court in Eswatini set aside a decision by the High Court which had dismissed an application by an LGBTQIA+ organization to register as a non-profit organization. The 5-member bench said the decision by the registrar of companies to deny the bid was unfair. The Supreme Court judgment ordered the minister responsible to reconsider the application and give a decision in 60 days from the judgment. We speak now to Melusi Simelane from the Southern African Litigation Centre, who brought the application. Melusi, thank you very much for your time this morning. This has been characterized as a landmark victory. Give us a little bit of context in terms of how we got here.
Thank you so much, and good morning, Dudu, to your viewers. It's a monumentous judgment, of course, because we look at when it started in 2019. And I think it's poignant that the Supreme Court judgment has come out during Pride Month, because the history of the registration of this case begins in 2018 when Swaziland hosted its very first Pride Parade. But during the hosting of that very first Pride Parade, we realized that there was a gap in the sense that there was no LGBT organization, particularly an organization that is clear on its objectives and in its name and its mandate, that it's meant to advocate for LGBTQ rights in Swaziland. That's why then in 2019, myself and a group of other fellow Swazis, we came together to form an organization called the Eswatini Sexual and Gender Minorities, because the name had been changed by that time. And we knew it would be an uphill battle, and we have been fighting through the High Court, and now we feel we've been vindicated by the Supreme Court, which has actually agreed with us in the sense that the registrar of companies was wrong in denying us our rights to freedom of association. Particularly, if you read the judgment, the justices unanimously agree that the registrar even fails to explain which amongst the objectives of this organization are actually the ones that might be problematic for the country.
You mentioned that you knew it would be an uphill battle to register this organization. What should that tell us about the environment or the space for members of the LGBTQI community in Eswatini?
It's not an easy space, and many people think because it's different from other spaces, let's say, for instance, Uganda right now, let's say Ghana, or any other place in Africa where it's really hostile, and therefore people think, well, you guys have it easy. But the truth of the matter is it's not, because lived experiences of people vary from different areas. I myself always count myself as one of those few who are actually privileged to have the sort of security buffer that I have in terms of the community that I live amongst, the people that I work with. But there are many different LGBTQ people who have horrible experiences, and each and every day when I do my work, I meet them and they tell me their stories. Some of them, they get the abuse from their homes, just waking up in the morning. They're in families that actually do not welcome them. But some do have families that welcome them, but the issue starts when it comes to community. Just last year, it was reported that in the capital city of Mbabane, there was an assault of a trans woman in the bus rank. But the police never even took that issue serious. And you see a trend where there's constant violations of human rights, there's constant physical violence of LGBTQ people. But because there's this sort of ambiguity with the law, therefore law enforcement cannot act. Either they're deliberately not acting because they do not take LGBTQ lives seriously, or it's this ambiguity on the side of the state that what is the stance of LGBTQ rights in the country, which is why, as the Southern African Litigation Centre, we've continued to support this organization in Swaziland, as we do across the continent, to make sure that we at least establish the protection of LGBTQ rights as fundamental human rights. How
do you do that when the law is ambiguous? What should that tell us? Is there nothing that speaks to it?
I think we then have to take a step back to the colonial era sodomy offense. I mean, in South Africa, it was done away with very early in the democratization of the country. In Botswana, it has recently been done away with. In Swaziland, we still have that colonial remnant, the criminalization of same-sex intimacy, particularly for men. And I think that is where the crux of the problem is, because you find that in some countries, particularly in Commonwealth countries and in Africa, in Southern Africa, you find that it's not being LGBTQ that's criminal, it's actually the same-sex intimacy that's criminalized. And therefore, it creates room for people to continue to lobby. But what we constantly face is the fact that it's not just criminalizing the same-sex intimacy, it's actually access to human rights services, it's access to housing, it's access to education, it's access to the jobs market. And people are constantly being denied their human rights because they go back to this colonial era criminalization of same-sex intimacy. Let's go to the ESGM case, for instance. What the registrar of companies in the country argued for denying to register ESGM was the fact that, well, it's criminal for same-sex men to engage in intimacy. And the Supreme Court has actually vindicated us in saying, well, even so, some people within the LGBTQ community cannot be criminalized because they can never engage in this criminalized sodomy. So it gets to show you that it's difficult to do the work, but we have to constantly try to find the low-lying fruits, particularly the freedom of association, the freedom of expression, so that we can slowly but surely establish the primacy and the importance and the significance of protecting the broader LGBTQ rights. And then perhaps one day we are going to get to the point where we now start dealing head-on with the elephant in the room, which is the criminalization of same-sex intimacy. And we are seeing it, of course, in Malawi, where we were trying to support a case of freedom of association, but then somehow the state hurried to bring in a case of decriminalization, which is still in the High Court. And I think that's how we as the Southern African Litigation Centre will continue to work with activists on the ground in finding the easiest way to deal with their issues so we can once and for all establish that LGBTQ rights are human rights.
Sure. You speak of the low-hanging fruit and the elephant in the room. And then you also speak of the colonial legacy in terms of the legislation, right? You also point out that you are quite privileged in terms of the security that you enjoy from the community that is around you. How should we understand Eswatini as a kingdom in terms of perhaps the social psychology of people? It is quite an intimate country in terms of population. And so in trying to get through that, because legislation is one thing, changing mindsets is another, what should we understand? Is it a conservative society? Is it a conservative kingdom? And the work that needs to be done to get to a level where you go to umakhulu or tatumkhulu and you explain to them what they need to understand.
I think you are right to bring up the issue of the intimacy of the country being such a small community. And I was speaking to my colleagues who were actually worried about the Supreme Court judgment of Namibia, who were saying they are now seeing a sort of an attack, a backlash. And I was saying, well, if they are on the streets, we must also come out to the streets. And then I had to quickly realize that context matters. For me in Swaziland, as I've said, I enjoy this sort of community because, like you are saying, it's a small country, it's an intimate country where we are almost always related to the next person. So it makes for an easier conversation. But be as it may, it's a very conservative country. And I don't even think in the conventional sense of being a conservative nation, it's this issue of religious fanaticism and this obsession with culture and tradition, not actually understanding that culture and tradition itself evolves over time, and therefore us as the new generation or those that come after us must be allowed to evolve with their own cultures and their own practices. But of course you're right, it's a very difficult situation with the conservatism, but we constantly use these relations to make sure that you can talk to your neighbors because you know them, you know their relations, and you perhaps know their family trees, and therefore it makes for an easier way to do the advocacy. And I think raising that point actually reminds me of what we are trying to do with activists on the ground, which is to decolonize the activism itself. Because too many times we learn, of course, it's understandable that we must learn from our friends from the West, from South Africa particularly, who has actually moved the needle forward in terms of protecting LGBTQ rights. But we must decolonize and actually contextualize how we do activism. We must use these communities that we live in must use these families that we are related to make sure that we're constantly having this conversation, because it's not about people actually taking our word as the truth and the gospel. It's about having the conversations. And I think I love what this whole Pride Month actually does for LGBTQ rights across the spectrum, because it creates conversations so that people can agree to disagree, but at the end of the day come to the conclusion that there are bigger issues to deal with. There's climate change, there's poverty, there's inequality, and if you transcend your nationality, there's issues of immigration, and it needs for us to come together as communities to deal with those issues. But we cannot if we are constantly battling, oh, that one is gay, oh, that one is black, oh, that one is poor, oh, that one. So I think it's about decolonizing the way that we do activism and actually using the communities that we live in to push the conversation forward.
Melusi, I do beg your pardon for asking you at the tail end of the interview your preferred pronoun.
He.
Thank you very much for your time. You wanted to say something. Please finish your thought.
No. I was just laughing. You asked me at the end, but thank you so much for your time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Melusi Simelane is with the Southern African Litigation Centre.